All right, well,
All right, so
David, I may be recruiting soon.
We're hiring some new roadies.
I'll be your PA. I'll bring your coffee.
Nice. Okay. So Alex seems dissatisfied with my objection.
Yeah, I thought there was well, maybe we should recap or something before I try responding to an objection that isn't in this hangout.
Yeah. Well, should we start with Jack? Do you want to start by just going through what the interpretation argument is?
Okay. So, so the idea is that when we interpret a text, I take it that what we're doing is constructing a hypothesis about what the author intends by use of a given string of symbols, right? Words, marks on a page, or what have you. And so in order for interpretations to be justified, right, we have to be able to appeal to something that allows us to rule out some interpretations as being unlikely to be consistent with the intentions of the author, and rule in interpretations that are likely to be consistent with the intentions of an author. And the problem that I'm raising is that our knowledge of God is derived from Scripture. Our knowledge of what kind of intentions God has are derived from Scripture, right? But we can't just circularly appeal to Scripture to tell us as what intentions God is likely to have to allow us to decide in favor of some interpretations as being more likely consistent with his intentions than others, right? But we don't have independent access to God's intentions to allow us to do that. And so therefore, it's not possible to interpret texts that are given by divine beings, right? That's sort of the general objection. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Alex, do you want to go with your objection first or mine?
Well, so let's just get this one out of the way. So there's this general, I mean, if you take the assumption behind Jack's argument in a certain way, which may not be the right way, but if the idea was that it's impossible to understand a message without being previously directly acquainted with the intentions of the sender of the message, then that seems like it's too strong a requirement, because obviously no one is ever really directly acquainted with anybody else's intentions, and it would seem to make all communication impossible. So there must be some weaker assumption at play rather than that one. I think everyone's just going to be happy, but I don't hear anyone saying passionately defending that version of the first premise, right? That's not really what you mean, is it, Jack?
Well, I was asking you whether you thought the informal characterization was consistent with that formalization.
I think it would be unfair to characterize it as that. I mean, this is the interpretation of the interpretation argument now, but right. I mean, it seems to me that that's not what you mean. And I mean, I'm appealing to you to tell me what your intuition, what your intention is.
Well, that's why I was talking about constraints, right? I'm saying that we have to have some kind of background assumptions about what an author is likely to intend or not intend.
Yeah, and then there's some constraints on those assumptions in the sense that obviously you could kind of artificially construct some background assumptions once you've find the text and say, well, it must be from this type of sender because that fits with the type of message, and that would be ad hoc, right?
Yeah.
So the constraints are things like that, like it not being ad hoc. So it's the same as a kind of, as you said, it's a kind of sort of scientific hypothesis forming exercise that we're doing here with the same.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah, okay. Right. So it seems to me that if you go down that route, then so like if my objection was recast, I mean, so if we were putting the analog as a scientific point, so it might be something like for any observation, it's compatible with any number of explanatory hypotheses or something. And the only way that we can rule in or out hypotheses is, like you said, on the basis of background assumptions and with some kind of constraints, minimally being things like not just forming ad hoc background assumptions that artificially fit the situation, right? So, and it's basically that problem about explaining observations in terms of scientific hypotheses. The same thing here, just trying to get to the interpretation of a piece of text, or at least trying to identify the intentions of the author of the text. So by correct interpretation, it's kind of implicit in the background here that correct interpretation is the one that kind of pins directly onto the intentions of the author, right? And that the purpose of sending a message is simply to communicate those intentions. I mean, both of those things are background assumptions that you're just stating as part of the argument, right?
Yeah, I'm assuming that the meaning of a text is given by the intentions of an author, right? So if somebody's going to try to contest that, that's going to be a whole different discussion. But I think most theists will agree that if God were to utter a message, the meaning of the message would be what God intended.
Right. So I mean, I think that line is makeable, though. That that in some sense it's kind of naive to think about and I guess this is what, like, fully pressed, where the Wittgensteinian point goes, where like the idea of there being a simple, like, center of the dartboard perfect interpretation of a piece of text, and that just being this kind of revealing the intentions of the author somehow, just mapping onto them perfectly, that idea is like, that's what the private language argument is kind of objecting to, and the purpose is supposed to be that, like, language has to function in such a way that like it functions in the public sphere basically completely, and that it has to operate in such a way that like, so once you say something or write it down or send a message or something, it's now detached from your intentions and kind of sent off into the world, where it will be continually reinterpreted without any kind of like, the idea of it being correctly interpreted is kind of a misnomer in principle. So I mean, I think that argument could be made. I'm not necessarily saying that you have to make that. I mean, if you're going to make that argument, then I mean, the end goal of this was supposed to be that the Bible can't be interpreted correctly or something. And I mean, this objection to your first premise could directly entail that no text could be perfectly interpreted. Right? There's no such thing as a correct interpretation, basically. So I mean, it gets to the same destination if that's where you want to go with it. So while I think that you could make that argument, I'm quite happy to just, like, let's just say what we mean by correct interpretation is one that latches onto the intentions of the author. And I mean,
it's hard for me to understand if you said Joe is a smart guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
I might think, well, Alex is being sarcastic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And somebody else might think, no, he was sincerely saying that Joe was a smart guy, right? So you have two different interpretations, right?
Yeah.
One is that it should be taken literally, is that it should be taken ironically, right? I take it that it was, what settles that question is what you intended, right? Do you think anybody's going to controvert that?
I mean, so yeah, I mean, sometimes that well, so there's two different like things going on here, and it's not quite clear to me. Well, I'm not necessarily saying that this is my view, right? I mean, I'm kind of, I've got in the back of my mind, there's this kind of like, there's this postmodern thing that's kind of Derrida, Karl Barth kind of idea that the author's intentions kind of can't really be the be-all and the end-all of the meaning of the text. Like,
Okay,
so,
yeah.
and then there's the other idea, which is that like I could quite conceivably say something to you with less than determinate intentions, in which case, does it thereby in principle render what I say unintelligible to you? So maybe I kind of mean both of them. So people often say things like that. I kind of half mean it seriously, half mean it as a joke. Now, if you said to me, but you have to pick one of them as your intention, it just seems like, why? That's like again, it seems a kind of naive.
Well, but I'm not saying
with
that
the
it
latter
couldn't
one,
be.
I think we would just consider that a causal disposition.
No, but the thing is, you could intend ambiguous, right?
Well, but that's just saying I have to have a determinate intention, which is to be ambiguous. I could just be ambiguous without
But
having.
all right, but let's say that it's God who says Joe is a smart guy. Do you know a theist that would say that whether that's ironic or not is going to depend on something other than what God intended? Because see, I think
No, I don't.
It's true that there are postmodern. I mean, I guess there are postmodernist theists as well, right? And there are Wittgensteinian theists as well. But see, I'm not really. It's just irrelevant to the debate to me if somebody's going to deny the intentionalist thesis, right? Then.
Yeah, and I don't mean to derail this conversation
Yeah.
by going down that route.
Yeah.
I mean, but it is there. I mean, anyway. So
yeah, I understand that there are people who deny the intentionalist thesis about interpretation, you know,
Yeah.
but it just doesn't really seem very likely that I'm going to encounter a theist of that kind, you know.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't really want to talk to them likely if they did have a view like that, you know, because I don't debate postmodernists. And so forth, you know. I just don't. It's like debating a Thomist, you know. I don't really. I don't think it's particularly interesting to be in discussions with people like that.
Yeah, and it's like trying to debate with a dialectist or something.
Exactly.
So, yeah, it does kind of call into question so much that the kind of politics of debate have gone out of the window or something. So yeah, fair enough. Okay, so the idea was. So
I very much approve of Dionysus being used as the benchmark of people that we would not want to speak to.
He didn't say Dionysus. He said dialetheist. Those are people who deny the.
I thought Alex was onto something there.
No, I don't have any problem with a follower of Dionysius.
No, there's a guy on G+.
I thought he said Dionysus too.
There's a guy on G+ named Dionysus, and he's sort of he's just basically the paradigm of a numbskull.
Okay.
So that's why they were pleased that you were independently confirming their view of Dionysus.
No, okay. So no, but okay. So let's put to one side the postmodernist and indeed the dialetheist objection. So then the thought was, so here's the kind of fallback secondary line of worry that I have, and this is not so much an objection. Like this is what I was saying before, which is that there still seems to be something which is quite strong about the idea, which of interpreting the text along the lines that you were suggesting, with the background information, hypothesis forming, blah, 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 right? So the worry would be that, so I mean, so I gave the example before of if if you find a message in a bottle washed up on the shore and you open it up and read it, then okay, maybe you don't know the person, and so in some sense it's challenging to reliably guess the intentions behind the message or something. But then the response to that is, well, it seems reasonable to assume certain minimal things about the sender of the message. For instance, it's the sort of thing that a human would do, right? I mean, it's on Earth. It's a, you know, people put messages in bottles sometimes, right? And so then you can at least infer that they're this kind of similar to me and you. You might not exactly be able to get it. Might be some kind of secret cipher, and you might be misunderstanding it. Right? You can't really rule that out. But then again, you can like have some kind of lukewarm confidence that it's to be taken at face value, something along those lines. Okay, so that seems reasonable. But then the step in that same direction away from the person that you know from the person you don't know is to something kind of very very different from the comfortable case. So there's the idea of SETI, who are listening through huge radio antennas for messages from outer space or something, right? And the worry there is that, well, were they to receive something that they thought was a message, then in order to be able to determine that it is a message, never mind what it says, just the fact that it is a message, you seem to have to be employing some kind of assumptions about a radically different type of agent, about whom you can only hypothesize in the most general sense about what they might be intending. And it seems to me that there isn't really any difference between the People's Project at SETI and the people who are interpreting the Bible, even on this hypothesis, right? So if it's impossible to understand the message in the Bible on the basis that the intentions of the sender are like kind of entirely other, then it should follow, it seems to me, that the understanding the message, potential message, or identifying something as a potential message in the SETI experiment should be equally unlikely. And so if this is an a priori argument against interpreting the Bible, we should be able to just knock on the door to the people at SETI and run through the premises with them, and they should accept it and shut down. And the idea is not just that this isn't really a knockdown argument, but it's a kind of, if you don't think that it works for SETI, but you do think that it works for the Bible, then there must be something in virtue of which there's a difference. So I guess either, so my point here is that are you going to bite the bullet and say, yes, the people in SETI are stupid for the same reason, or are you going to say, no, there's something in virtue of which SETI counts as a rational thing to do, but trying to understand the Bible doesn't count as a rational thing to do? So I suppose that's my fallback objection or worry or something.
Yeah, well, my response to that is to say, look, either in the SETI case, we can say that we can actually appeal to certain types of background assumptions that are similar to the case of the message in a bottle, where we can say, well, we can imagine that it's likely that there are creatures that have evolved that have similar intelligences to us, right? And that would try to send messages across the galaxy, and they would go about it in this kind of way, right? In which case, then we would, we might be able to say favor that interpretation over another, or if that's going to be accused of being ad hoc, right, we can just then say, well, my prior probabilities, sorry, am I still connected?
Yeah.
My prior probabilities favor that hypothesis over some rival hypothesis, right? Because there are going to be some hypotheses where the evidence is going to be consistent with both. The evidence is going to be equally consistent with some rival hypothesis, right? So the hypothesis that you're a pea zombie,
Mm-hmm.
I'd say there can't be evidence for or against that, seems to me, right? So if somebody says, well, if the evidence is, if the evidence is equally consistent with both hypotheses, why favor one over the other? All I can really do there is appeal to prior probabilities.
Right. So then, I mean, if we're at that juncture, then, because it does seem to me that it is ad hoc in exactly the same way to say, well, I mean, if we're to suppose that there are aliens who have this kind of intention to send messages through radio waves and blah blah blah, then it follows that this thing is likely to be a message. That's ad hoc in exactly the same way as if you say, well, let's just assume that there is a loving God and he wants us to understand this message and blah blah blah. Then we can assume that this is the message, right? So it seems that those two cases are, if one's ad hoc, the other one's ad hoc, right? So then on the second case where you just say, well, look, I have prior probabilities which tell me that it's more likely, then I don't see why the person interpreting the Bible can't just go, well, I have prior probabilities which tell me that it's likely to be a message sent from a loving God then in that case, in which case does the argument not, I mean, it seems like they're on an equal footing now.
No, because I don't think so, because the SETI, what I'm saying to the SETI proponent, SETI skeptic, is, look, I can't claim my assumption about how to interpret this is better than yours, right? I'm just going with it, right? I don't think the theist wants to say that.
Oh, I see, right. So they're not just defending that it's rational to believe that this is a message from God, but that they are certain that
well, I would object to saying that it was rational, because it seems to me irrational to favor prior probabilities.
Well, it's as rational as your willingness to accept that this could be a message from an alien species.
Yes.
As rational as that. Right?
Yeah,
but you're saying if they make a claim that's any stronger than that, such that they are certain that it's a message from this type of,
well, they don't have to say that it's certain. They just have to say, look, you're reading the text incorrectly. You're interpreting God incorrectly, right? Now, you might say to them, are you certain of that? And they would say, no, I'm a fallibilist.
Mm-hmm.
I can't be certain, about anything. But the point is, nonetheless, they're gonna insist, look, you're wrong to think this, right?
So they're saying the degree of belief is quite high, really. Right.
Yeah.
And whereas that's different from you in the SETI case, where you just sort of shrug your shoulders and go, well, I just think it is.
Well, my degree of belief that you're not a P-zombie is quite high, right? But I wouldn't argue with somebody. What could I appeal to if somebody were to suddenly say, well, I think Alex is a P-zombie, right? I couldn't appeal to any evidence.
Yeah, it strikes me as kind of disanalogous in the sense that, like, plausibly anyway, that your belief in other minds is kind of plays a fundamental role. It's kind of like a properly basic belief, maybe.
Yeah, but that's
something like that.
Well,
that's
where you're. No, but that's where you're going towards, I think. Because see, this is how Matt Bell thinks he can respond to the objection. Is he thinks he can just say something like his belief that the Bible means, or some biblical verse means X is something like a properly basic belief, right?
Well, it seems to me that the case of the belief in other minds is different from the interpretation of any given piece of text because in one case it's plausibly rendered as a properly basic belief, and in the other it's not. So
well, you'll have to tell me what criteria of proper basicality you're using, because look, I don't think, because see, like I understand that there's going to be some beliefs that you can't really rationally question, right? So I can certainly understand a criterion of proper basicality like that, right? But I just don't see how the belief in other minds is anything other than some belief that is rationalized in terms of prior probabilities. And I don't see why we would say prior probabilities are a criterion of proper basicality, No,
that's not what counts as a criterion of proper basicality.
Yeah,
sure.
So what's different about, why is it a requisite for rationality that I assume you're not a P-zombie? It's a requirement for me to have a discussion with you, right? But somebody else comes along and says, look, I don't have discussions with Alex because I think he's a p-zombie. What would be the point of having discussions with him? You know, could I say that that person was irrational, or that there was a good reason, I mean, is there some kind of argument that I could give? I don't think I could.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, it is an interesting question what the criteria would be that distinguishes, and I'm not going to say that I've got an answer. That I mean, for me, it's something like a prior probability or something along, at least a kind of intuition or something that, and maybe it's just because I'm familiar with the typical kind of Alvin Plantinga examples of what counts as a properly basic belief, right? But I mean, if somebody said, "Look, I just think this one guy is a p-zombie and nobody else is," then that could be appealed against on the basis that it's kind of it's irrational to treat one case differently from another. I don't believe there's any minds at all. Then it's much harder to see why that's.
Yeah, but see, again, I'm giving you my account, right, of what I think, how we evaluate hypotheses, right?
Yeah.
And so on my account, now somebody could contest this, and I'm certainly open to it being contested, because I don't claim to have the definitive answers on these questions, right? This is just the best I've been able to come up with. But what I understand to be going on in evaluation of competing hypotheses is, if you have two hypotheses that equally predict the data observed, right, you need to be able to appeal to further explanatory virtues to favor one over the other, right? One example of an explanatory virtue is going to be predictive novelty, right? Yeah. But if you don't have that in this case, then I'm not sure what other explanatory virtues you're going to be able to appeal to say that somebody is irrational for suggesting that Alex is a p-zombie, right? Because he could just say, look, it's just a strong intuition that I have, right? And somebody else could say, well, why is that different from us believing that anybody is not a p-zombie? Isn't it just a strong intuition that we have that other people are minded just like we are, right? I don't really see what else I could say other than that's what it is, a very strong intuition that I have, right? Because I don't see what evidence I could appeal to that would favor that interpretation over the p-zombie hypothesis, right?
What about their testimony about their intentionality and qualia?
But a p-zombie would be able to make testimonials too.
Yeah.
So that's, I don't think you can appeal to evidence.
It's like talking to a Turing machine, basically.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, so I don't think that there is like a razor wire distinction here that cuts neatly these things in half. I mean, I certainly don't have that anyway. So, I mean, it still seems to me, given everything you said then, that as a far less than watertight principle to appeal to, it does seem like if you're treating everybody the same apart from this one person, then that fact alone seems to counterbalance the fact that you have some kind of otherwise baseless intuition that they're a p-zombie. I mean, and that might be enough to make you think that that's kind of weird, at least, maybe not completely irrational, but it's like it's in the right direction for being irrational. But I feel like we've wandered slightly off the path here to.
Yeah. So all I'm saying, if to get back on the path, right? All I'm saying is I don't think the theist wants to say that, the hypothesis that God is declaring that he's triune is no better justified than the hypothesis that these verses mean that God is telling you how to make a brownie, right? I don't think they want to just appeal to the claim, well, that's just how it seems to me. very strongly.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So I don't think that's a good answer to the objection.
Well, so let's just be clear then. So I just wanted to, because what I was asking you for was something that differentiates the SETI case, which presumably isn't taken to be susceptible to the same objection, and from the Bible case.
So what I'm saying is,
Let's just be clear about what that is.
yeah. So what I'm saying is, in the SETI case, is look, unless, I mean, because I take it that the SETI hypothesis might be one which we could get further evidence for or against, right? Maybe we could discover corroborating evidence that it was an alien intelligence or not, right? But in the absence of corroborating evidence of that kind, right? If somebody were to say, look, I don't think that the evidence suggests this is an alien intelligence is better than the hypothesis that some unknown mechanism accounts for this, some unknown non-intelligent mechanism accounts for this, right? I would just have to say, yeah, I don't have an argument against that. My prior probabilities just favor thinking it's probably an alien intelligence, right? But I can't show that the alternative hypothesis is irrational, right? That's all I would say in the SETI case, because I haven't yet encountered anybody explain what else I could say there, you know? So it seems to me, given that objection, I'd have to concede, look, ultimately I have to be agnostic about this. I just happen to favor one hypothesis over the other as just being more intuitively plausible.
Okay, so and then the corresponding degree of belief that you have in any given instance of something being a message from outer space rather than explainable by some other phenomenon is, you know, minimal, right? You don't have a strong, there isn't really very much. So something like, it would be very difficult for you to be like, I am strongly confident that this is a message from
well, if I were confident, I wouldn't be able to give anything to justify it, right? I could be confident, right? I'm very confident that you have a mind, right? But
let's say,
said, well, what's your evidence for that? Really be able to say I have anything that justifies that confidence.
Well, okay, so then there's, when we come to the biblical example, if someone is confident and has really no reason why, you don't just go, oh, okay, that's just like my belief in other minds then, great, right? You still.
Well, I take it that the theist. I take it that the theist wants to say that they have better reasons to believe that some interpretation that they have is the correct one, as opposed to their rivals, right? But in order to do that, they'd have to be able to appeal, right, to certain criteria about how to interpret the text as being more likely consistent with the intentions of the divine author or the divine inspirer, right, than some other interpretation, some other proposed interpretation, right?
The argument, as I'd envisaged it before, was something with a kind of slightly more ambitious, I suppose. So it was something like, it was supposed to establish this kind of like a priori impossibility of interpreting the Bible correctly on the basis of this thing to do with not being able to get at the intentions. But really, it seems to me that when pressed on it, what you're saying is that, in fact, a theist could be rationally justified in believing that the.
Well, I wouldn't use the term rationally justified.
Well, I mean, any more than, but when
I
I
would
said,
just say
what if
that
they just say?
I would just say, yeah. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, so if I'm giving you this example of someone who says, look, I believe that I've got the right interpretation of the Bible in the same way that I believe that you're not a pea zombie. I don't really have any evidence for either of them, but I'm, you know, I just feel confident, you know, and
I would call that irrational.
Right. But you know, it seems to me that they avoid they're not in your targets for this argument. What you're really targeting is someone who's saying, look, I'm really like kind of quite strongly. I feel somehow that I have like good epistemic justification for this, which is different
Yes.
from
Yes.
this other type. So I mean, the person who just says, "Look, I just take it to be properly basic belief," kind of escapes this argument from your
Yeah,
perspective.
they escape it, but they escape it at a very high price, right? Because it's similar to why Plantinga was troubled by the Great Pumpkin objection, right? It's going to be hard for a theist to walk around saying, look, I really have no good rational grounds to think that, you know, to think that it's more likely that God is trying to tell me that he's triune than that he's a fan of brownies, right? Fan of chocolate brownies, right? I really don't have any basis, right? No, I really don't have any rational basis to believe that, right? That the evidence is going to be equally consistent with that and every other wild hypothesis as to what the text means, right? That's why Plantinga was troubled by the Great Pumpkin objection, because he constructed things in such a way, right, that it seemed like, well, the person who believes in the Great Pumpkin is just as rational, right, as the person who believes in the God of Christianity, by the way he'd constructed rationality. And how was that some kind of a victory, right, against, how was it a victory for him to have produced an analysis like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody wants to say, look, yeah, the cookbook hypothesis is just as rationally justified as the standard Christian reading, or the standard Westminster Confession reading, or what have you, right? If they want to say that, I don't have an argument with that, right? But then they're basically, what kind of apologetic could you have on that basis? Somebody saying, look, I don't really have any good reasons to give you why you should accept my reading,
Okay, well then,
but nonetheless,
also,
this is what I believe,
I'm really trying to establish the kind of baseline here that it's not an a priori argument about the impossibility of holding such a position, or even the
but see, what I'm trying to
irrationality
stress, is a certain kind of triviality, right, about
yeah,
what you're saying.
I totally get it. And I
okay,
understand.
okay,
Right. So
all right.
So, but just to build on it, then it seems to me that you not only could. So, okay, let's grant that somebody, like you said, a theist could just go, look, I just have this as a properly basic belief. No real reason. Obviously, there isn't really anything that justifies that because it's a properly basic belief. And like you said, someone else could just come along and say, I just feel like I've got a properly basic belief that it's actually a cookbook or something. Okay,
right.
And that's you can have that if you want to. That's a bit weird. It's not much of a victory. Okay, got it. Granted, absolutely.
Okay.
But then, so building on that, the theist is presumably going to say something like, well, but it's not that I just have a properly basic belief. I'm merely establishing that it's, that's. I mean, because the point is, if you were able to rule that out, then it seems like you wouldn't be able to build up from it. But let's say that if you're granting that that's possible, then they're going to say, well, look, I do have background information that I take to be good background information. For instance, the classic theological arguments, I take them to be sound arguments, and the evidence from personal experience, and blah, 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 blah. And they build up this picture, and they say, well, that informs me. That's why. Just like if you thought that you had you'd done the sums and you'd figured out that there must be alien life or something.
No, but you're going to have to take me through that, because see, I don't think it's quite. I don't think that is going to probably work, even though it sounds good.
Well, I'm just saying that seems to be what you're more like. I mean, what if you're talking about because it started off, I was thinking about just this kind of a priori in principle thing.
See,
now we're talking about what would a Christian actually say. I'm pretty sure that's what.
Yeah, but but let's talk about that, right? So let's start with the Let's start with the first prophet, right? The first prophet. Let's say he's very smart, right? And he constructs a couple of a priori arguments, or a couple of arguments from natural theology, right? That a God exists. Now, he's going to get what? That there's an omnipotent, omniscient being that's the creator? Is that going to tell him how to interpret God's message? I don't think so. It doesn't
No.
tell you anything. Now, if he wants to say that he can somehow infer that God is omnibenevolent, right, through some kind of most perfect being theology or something like that, right?
Can I say something really quick?
Yeah.
I don't know how much time Alex has. I think Alex wants to say something like, well, a Christian can make a cumulative case for the existence of God and then start there and say, or even just use a counterfactual and say, if God exists, if you grant the existence of the Christian God, then he knows all true propositions and he's able to share that with the knowing subject, the agent, and therefore the agent has some epistemic justification in that sense. Or you can just build a case for it and start from there. Am I correct, or am I not following?
I was thinking of the cumulative case idea. I certainly wasn't thinking that an omnipotent God could just allow you to have certainty about the.
I was more talking about omniscience as God knows all true propositions and is able to share that with the knowing subject, the agent, in this case the Christian.
No, I don't think that God could share. Any way that God would share his knowledge with an agent would be no better than writing it on a piece of paper and handing it to him, and it would be in exactly the same position.
The Christian would either appeal to revelation via scripture or direct transfer of information via the Holy Spirit, like you would.
No, I don't think that direct transfer of information via the Holy Spirit is any different from writing it on a piece of paper and handing it to the person. It would still need to be interpreted, and we'd be in exactly the same boat we're in now. I mean, I can imagine that someone could build a cumulative case on the basis that they personally find lots of small pieces of information that might be only minimally persuasive, that build the background information in such a way that they effectively have prior probabilities when coming to assess this piece of information, which gives them reason to think that this is sent from that same intelligence. And that seems to me that the case could be made there. And to unpick that, what you'd have to do is, for each and every piece of supporting evidence, show that the case that was made for it was in fact far weaker than they'd thought. And I mean, I'm not making that position, right? But somebody would do, I think. And William Lane Craig, I guess, would, or you know, any normal non-presuppositionalist, like a classical theist, would have a whole bunch of arguments and pieces of evidence and stuff, and they wouldn't just rely on one of them at a time. And it would inform your background information in much the same way that the scientific person takes all different pieces of evidence to be confirmatory of like a kind of evolution or something. It doesn't rest on one thing. It's like there's lots of different background pieces of information that mean that when you come to examine this shell or something, you think you've got good reason to interpret it against this hypothesis. I mean, you do have good reason to interpret against that hypothesis, let's say, but I think that once you retreat back to this point when you say, look, the only reason I have for thinking that the SETI case is like, that it's like somewhat plausible, at least. I think the Christian could at least mount the same type of thing, and then it would be a very complicated question of like having to go through and unpick. I mean, and to some extent, like I find these types of arguments less interesting, because what we're doing now is we're talking about like what counts as rational for an agent to believe in, and then that means you have to take into account all of their individual pieces of background information. I mean, I just think that you could be rational in holding that view because you already have these otherwise seemingly justified background beliefs. So that, I mean, if you do have those background beliefs, I think it could be rational to interpret the Bible along those lines. If that's what we've come to, then I'm not gonna. I mean, I think that you probably could make go through those surgically one by one and say, really the evidence for the resurrection isn't nearly as good as you thought it was, so you should take that out. And this ontological argument kind of got this weird thing here, and it's not as strong as you thought, and blah blah blah, and undermine that large case probably. But like, it would be very difficult to do, and then you're not really talking about the interpretation argument anymore. You're just saying, just an agent, some mythical agent here, and just saying.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, look, we can grant them both a priori arguments and arguments from natural theology that God is a creator. There's a creator God, and that he's all-knowing and all good. And let's throw in omnibenevolence. Now, that's the interesting one, right? Because if he's merely omnipotent, it doesn't tell us anything about what he'd likely do, right? And so the text would still be inscrutable. I mean, you could interpret it, but you'd just be saying that it's intuitively plausible. This is what he means, right? Now, if you want to claim that you have independent knowledge that God is all good, right? Which I think is a very hard. I don't think anybody has ever given a good argument that they can infer that on a priori grounds or from natural theology. But let's just go with it, right? Let's say they have an independent argument to show that there's an all-knowing, all-powerful creator God that's also perfectly good, right?
Why does he have to be perfectly good?
Well, the reason why I think that could help is because they would say that it would be consistent with an all-good God that he would try to communicate with us in such a way that we could understand and get him right.
I don't see why that. I mean, it seems like it's a sufficient condition.
Well, I'm just saying. Look, what I'm saying is, I'm saying that an omnipotent, omniscient God alone is not something there could ever be evidence for, because we wouldn't have any idea of what things it would more likely want to do than others, right? There could never be evidence for the hypothesis that there's an omnipotent, omniscient God simplicator, right? Because all possible outcomes would be consistent with it, right? But if you build in something about the nature of the motivations of that being into your hypothesis, then it does actually potentially generate predictive expectations, right? So if I build into the hypothesis, not only is God not only is God all knowing and all powerful, he's also a perfectly good being. Somebody could argue, well, that generates the expectation we shouldn't see worlds with apparent gratuitous evils in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if we encounter worlds like that, we have evidence against the existence of that God. And if we encounter worlds without gratuitous evils in them, we have evidence that supports the existence of that God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you had the prophet on the hill, the first prophet on the hill, right, encountering a message from God, right, and he had independent arguments that there was an omnipotent or an omnipotent, omniscient creator God, that wouldn't tell him anything about how to interpret the message. He would still be able to say that every interpretation is equally consistent with the intentions of that being, so far as I know, because I know nothing about what he might want or not want, right? But if I build in that he's an all good God, let's say there's an argument from natural theology, or there's a perfect being theological a priori argument, like an ontological argument that establishes that that being is all good, right? He might want to say, well, that gives me a basis to think that some interpretations are going to be more plausible than others, because some motivations are more plausible. Some motivations seem to be more plausible than others, given that he's all good, right? So that gives you maybe a foothold. But see, I don't think it's going to give you a foothold that's going to ultimately succeed, because, and I think these are reasons I told you about the other day, the last time that we talked, right, is that either you're going to have to deal with the fact that the kinds of statements that are attributed to that God are actually things that we would normally attribute to an evil being, in which case you'd basically have evidence that that God is not a good God, or you'd have to explain them away by saying, yeah, the by taking the route of skeptical theism, right? Which is what you're going to say, look, normally we would say that anybody who would command such things or approve of such things, right, like smashing babies against rocks, right, or whatever's in Numbers 31 or any book like that, right? You're going to say, well, that isn't actually inconsistent with the hypothesis that God is all good, right? Because we are just finite beings, right, who don't actually have access to the reasons that justify God's conduct, God being God being all knowing and therefore having access to reasons that are unavailable to us, right? But if that's the case, then the hypothesis that God is actually all good doesn't generate any predictive expectations at all, and doesn't give you any idea as to what he might intend by some utterance, right? So I don't think that's going to help.
So I think that the SETI example I was given before is actually not quite analogous. So, because, and maybe you would actually bite the bullet now if I say this the right way, I think. So, the first prophet receiving this message, because your issue with that seems to be how would he know what this message means? Not is this a message from an omnipotent being or something, right? His worry is somebody pulling a trick on me. His worry is, given that this is in fact a message from God, what does it mean, right? So if we go to the SETI case, my worry was, how would you know that it's a message? But that's not what you were worrying about. So let's just say that we receive a message and it's in English, but we just know that it comes from Alpha Centauri or something, and it says, "Hi Jack, how are you doing?" or something, and then we go, "Shit, what does that mean? Is it a declaration of war? Are they the types of things that they taking the piss? Are they actually asking how you are? I mean, and how could we rule one of those in or out?" And then I think that at this point you would actually say, well, you just couldn't. I mean, you'd have to just hold all of those completely on par with one another.
Well, you could, right? You would just have prior probabilities.
I don't think how could you have prior probabilities that aliens are asking how you are?
But I'm just saying, because the thing is, somebody tells us something, we might.
The thing about it is, I think that you can still refer to some sort of background experience. I mean, SETI, they put out patterns in the universe. They're already assuming that the aliens that they'll contact will be aliens associated with aliens that want to find patterns, right? And that we'll see it as a communication.
Yeah, that's fine. But like the question, so I mean, I'm.
Well, see, I have the view. No, but you see, I have the view that intentional properties are actually perceived, right? So, I think when somebody says, "Hi, how are you?" I'm actually perceiving meanings, right? I'm perceiving the semantics. So I'm perceiving that it's either ironic or not ironic, right? But the problem is I could be perceiving incorrectly. And so if somebody were to raise the challenge, what justifies your belief that your perception is correct, I wouldn't actually be able to give an argument, right? Unless I could appeal to supporting evidence. Right, but in the case of the message written in English from Alpha Centauri, I don't have supporting evidence.
Yeah, that exactly. So there's no way of knowing you, and you wouldn't. I think it would be. You couldn't have prior probabilities that aliens.
No, you could because you could have prior probabilities because you could be appealing to your perception. You could just say, "Look, it just doesn't seem ironic to me." It seems like they're being sincere.
Then can you not take this exactly the same line with the message in the Bible? It just seems like God's telling me.
Well, I don't think they want to say that. I don't think they want to say that, because if that's what they're saying and somebody says, well, the reason why I believe the opposite is because it seems that way to me.
Yeah, they might say, look, it just seems really obvious what the meaning is here. It's just the literal meaning. It's just obviously not a menu or a.
But then if I say to them, well, the opposite seems obvious to me, what are they going to say? They're not going to be satisfied with that.
So if in the case where the alien says, "Hi Jack, how are you doing?" and you say, "Look, it's just obviously asking me how I'm doing," and I say, "Look,
well, it seems obvious."
Yeah, okay, and it seems really obvious to me that it's actually a joke. It's taking the piss. They're about to kill us, and it's a joke they say before they wipe. So it's really obvious. What are you going to say to me?
I'm not going to be able to say anything.
Right. So in that case,
I can do is say, look, it just doesn't seem that way to me. But you're right. The evidence.
Good. Right,
there's no evidence favoring one. Or the
okay.
other.
So then what this, because I'm going to have to go in a minute, but I think I'm satisfied at least in that. Really, when it comes down to it, I think you're biting the bullet and saying,
yes.
Ultimately, in the SETI case,
yes.
If we make it actually analogous, then you really can't have anything like good reason to favor one over another. It could just seem like the right one to you, but there's no real reason. Doesn't go any deeper than that, which is okay. So you're basically taking the bite the bullet.
I'm not necessarily intuitively satisfied with that. I just haven't seen anybody give me a criterion that I could use that that could favor a stronger claim.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think it's difficult to know what to make. Difficult to know how you could even begin to go around determining in the SETI case what was going on.
Yeah,
I was just trying to make sure that it was.
Yes, I am biting the bullet.
Consistent in that case.
I'm consistent. Yeah,
but I don't understand why it's biting the bullet if the argument is saying if we have no background information with the communicator, it's difficult to interpret the communication with respect to their intentions.
Well, the reason why it's biting a bullet is because I think a lot of people want to say, if you got it, like as Seamus was trying to suggest, that if you got a message like we're going to destroy the Earth tomorrow, that somehow you would want to say, look, we have really good reason to act. we better get off the Earth, by tomorrow, otherwise we're going to be, fried. Right. And what I'm saying is, I don't really see, if somebody were to be a skeptic, why should we get off the Earth? Right. I don't think that people who want to get off the Earth could say anything more than that. Well, I'm just not going to gamble, but I don't really have a good reason to think that the message is true, so that's why it's biting the bullet.
I think on that note, I'm going to have to jump out now, but thanks. It was enjoyable.
Yeah, and if you want to follow up, because if you still think that the line of objection that you were setting out is still valid, we should definitely talk that over next time you have time.
Yeah, good. I'll think more on it.
Okay.
All right, nice one. Take care, guys.
All right, so long.
Later.
Yeah. The last situation you described seems like a sort of Pascal's wager type situation.
Yeah. I agree. Yeah.
I still don't think it's biting the bullet. It's just another way you can present the argument, only this time you're not appealing to something that's divine.
Well, when he's saying bite the bullet, he's just saying, look, most people would say that we're justified, right? And if we got a message like that would be justified to interpret it a certain way. But if that could be justified, then it seems like interpretations of divinely authored text could be justified in the same way. So I'm biting the bullet in saying, look, I'm granting that we're not actually justified in those cases, even though most people might say that would have the intuition that we would be, right? I'm biting the bullet by saying, look, even though it seems like we have very good reasons to think that we could, be justified in interpreting a text this way, we really don't have any good reasons.
But the issue is that then it's the case that anyone who is claiming that they're inferring the intentions of God has access to that point. They could say, well, an issue arises with interpreting, alien messages. They all have access to it. It doesn't help us narrow down the hypotheses anymore, because they all can invoke this as what makes their hypothesis more likely than other hypotheses. And if that's the case, they're all still on like equal ground. The argument's asking what makes it so we could think that your interpretation is more accurate. We all know you can appeal to like literary criticism. You can appeal to this issue with interpreting aliens, but that's something that you all have access to. What is something that you could say you have access to that that like individuates you with respect to those other interpreters?
Yeah, they don't have I don't think they can have an answer.
You're just moving everything to the side more. I can't think of whether or not I want to say on level playing field, or like if you're just kicking the can, you're just going, you just went another step, but everyone went with you, right? And that's what's kind of well, there's an issue with that I have, but it's kind of frustrating that this point isn't really getting across to people. I need to come up with a better way to communicate it. But the other thing is, it still seems to me like they are pointing out that you could still narrow down hypotheses, because it could be the case that, well, no. I have to think about it a bit. What were you going to say?
Well, I don't think that they really can. I mean, it doesn't seem to me like they can.
Yeah.
There is really anything that they can appeal to.
Yeah, you can. There's any manner of. There's all sorts of different variations of the more prominent interpretations. So you still have a whole bunch of hypotheses that have the same access to this stuff. So that I was surprised at like how much of like Malpassy was going through. He was going through Matt's claims, hit the way he responded to the argument, and then he started doing what Shamos did.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, right. He hit upon both their solutions.
Although
independently. That is kind of neat, actually.
Yeah. And the thing with look, we have these independent arguments confirming it, but how do you identify that this God that's proven in this argument is the God of Christian theism? Because if you identify that God exists through the Kalam, isn't it the case that you're saying that the God who caused the Kalam is triune? But then there are people who don't think that. The very same book says that the God is triune. You're still going to have to deal with the interpretation. I mean, isn't the argument already going, look, you got this communication from God? Isn't it already going, there is, we can assume God to still show you that you can't ever like understand God's knowledge. So pointing out that you have auxiliary arguments to show that God exists the argument's already kind of giving you that to begin with. The problem the argument is pointing out is that you can't say you know God's intentions or you can understand them. So it doesn't. Wait, but why didn't we just say? Did you guys say that to Matt? that shuts down him appealing to tag minimal facts. Maybe not. Well, minimal facts. You can't. It would also be begging the question, I think. But appealing to fine tuning, him appealing to these other independent Christian or not Christian arguments for God. Look, we've been talking about how to understand this communication the whole time. Who was the communicator that we're talking about? It's God. We're granting God. This is now it's pissing me off.
Can we go off there,
No.
Joe?
Yeah.
What was it that David wanted to talk about,
Okay. I'll go off there now.
Joe?
He wanted to talk